Hey guys, tonight we begin a sleepy stroll through medieval Paris without getting arrested. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Juve arrived just as the bells of the Église Saint-Jacques toll the 9th hour, roughly 9 p.m. Though medieval timekeeping isn't particularly precise. The sun has set behind the tightly clustered rooftops of Paris, casting long shadows. Across the cobbled alleys, the city, even in its quieter moments, hums with a certain disjointed rhythm. Dogs barking, cartwheels creaking, and a distant cry of Fermez la Porte. From an unseen window, but you a visitor from another time, a curious wanderer must walk with care. This is not a city designed for aimless wandering, especially not at night. Medieval Paris in 1350 is, by all accounts, a marvel. It's the largest city in Christendom after Constantinople, home to over 200,000 souls, and a place of great learning, trade, and contradiction. The University of Paris is flourishing. Books are rare but increasingly copied by clerks and scholars. Stonemasons carve cathedrals that reach toward heaven, even as waste seeps down into the Seine below. But it's also a city of strict rules, many of which exist purely to maintain an idea of public order that is only loosely observed and rarely understood by its citizens, especially after dark. Your first challenge is illumination. If you intend to stroll after sunset, you must carry a lantern, not a torch. Not a candle stub, but a proper enclosed lantern with a glass face and some form of shielding. This is not for your benefit, but for the city guard. In 1350, a law passed. Under King Jean II, known sometimes as Jean the Good, though opinions very strictly forbids anyone from walking the streets at night without one. The law reads plainly, "No man nor woman shall walk the streets after curfew without a lantern to show their face, else be taken to chatelet for questioning." The reason is simple and dull. Crime. Thieves love darkness. Bandits, drunk students, and the occasional insurrectionist blend well into shadows. So the city's solution is to illuminate every face. If you carry a lantern, the watchmen can see you. If you don't, well, they can't, and that's the problem. So you'll need to acquire one. You pass by a cooper's stall, closing 4. The night, then an old woman selling rushlights, and finally spot a tallow chandler. A few coins, likely silver deniers, torn-waned. You now have a crude, smoky lantern that leaks both wax and light. You hold it aloft as you continue down. Rue Saint-Denis. It's a narrow street, hemmed in by leaning buildings with overhanging upper stories, their timber frames held in place by pegs and prayers. The smells are intense. Cured leather, old fish, and chamber pots emptied from above. You step cautiously. There's no drainage system per se, just central gutters running down the middle of the lane where everything unpleasant ends up. The common term for this is caniveau, but most simply call it what it is, the dirty street river. You pass the blackened husk of a former tavern burned in a student riot last year, and then cross through the shadows of St. Mary. The night watch eyes you from a corner for men, armed with halberds and short swords. Wearing dull blue tunics emblazoned with the fleur-de-lis, they nod, but say nothing. Your lantern has done its job. Now, if you were to speak to them, which is not advised, you'd learn a few things about their duties. The watch patrols the streets from dusk until dawn, focusing primarily on suspicious persons, illegal gatherings, brawls, and fires. Fires especially. In a city where roofs are thatched and walls are often wood, fire spreads faster than rumor, and rumor moves fast here. They also look for those breaking curfew. The curfew bell, rung from the belfry of Notre Dame each night, signals the time to extinguish all fires in hearths and lanterns, a confusing contradiction. You must carry a lantern, but not too late and not too bright. The rules shift based on the season, the moon phase, and the mood of the prelate, the city's chief magistrate. It's worth remembering that Paris, in 1350, is still recovering from the Black Death, The plague swept through just 2 years prior, killing perhaps half the population. Entire neighborhoods emptied, streets fell silent. It's said that bodies piled so high along Rue de la Ferronnière that carts had to detour. Those who remain now walk with cautious steps and muffled hopes, yet the city persists. A baker's apprentice, maybe 11 years old, rushes past you, clutching a small sack of flour. He glances up nervously at your lantern, then disappears into a side street. Children work long hours here. Apprenticeships begin at 7 or 8. By 11, many are already sleeping on workshop floors. You pause near the edge of a public square, the place de grève, where executions and announcements take place. Empty now, save for the iron outline of the pillory and a long wooden platform used for the occasional hanging or flogging. Justice in Paris is very public. If you were caught walking without a lantern, you wouldn't be executed, of course. But you might spend a night in the Chatelet, and that's punishment enough. The Chatelet isn't a castle, though the name suggests one. It's a grim administrative building that functions as a court, a prison, and a holding pen for everyone from drunks to debtors to spies. The cells are underground, poorly ventilated, and infested with rats. You've likely passed it without noticing. Its facade unremarkable, its presence quietly feared. You're careful not to appear too curious. Instead, you continue walking, past a shoemaker's shop, the shuttered stall of a parchment vendor, and then along the banks of the Seine, the river. Dark and sluggish, winds through the heart of the city like a second street, one used more for transport than beauty. Flat-bottomed boats drift silently by, sometimes lit by a dim candle or two. Bargemen shout back and forth, unloading crates of fish, wine, or firewood. The bridges, especially the Ponto Change and Ponto Notre Dame, are lined with houses and shops. At night they appear as silhouettes, crooked and closely packed, as if leaning into each other for warmth. You consider crossing, but remember another unwritten rule. Don't linger too long on bridges at night. They're narrow, often filled with beggars or stray animals, and easy places for trouble. A sudden noise startles you, a splash in the Seine. Followed by a muffled shout, you hold your lantern higher, but the dark swallows everything outside its narrow beam. Best not to investigate. In medieval Paris, most noises after dark are best left unexplored. You retreat from the riverbank and turn down Rue des Lombards, a street known for its money changers and lenders. Many are Italian from Lucca, Genoa, or Florence, and their presence here, though essential, is often resented. Rumors of usury, foreign plots, and gold hoards follow them. They've built solid stone houses and hired guards. Tonight their doors are barred, and the street is silent. You pass a wall plastered with official notices, some bearing the wax seal of the PRVT. You stop to read one. Let it be known that those found wandering without license past the tolling of the curfew bell shall be held accountable, lest they bring mischief or unrest. All tradesmen must cease activity by the 8th bell. Lanterns must be carried visibly, and no gatherings beyond 3 persons shall be tolerated without prior approval. Accounting yourself, just you good. It occurs to you that the rules are many, often arbitrary, and inconsistently enforced. A well-dressed scholar might be ignored. A drunken tanner might be whipped. Justice here is not blind. It is highly observant and very moody. As you turn toward your lodging, perhaps a rented room above a tavern or a modest inn run by nuns, you hear the distant chant of monks from a priory. Their voices rise softly, weaving Latin into the hush of the night. You exhale, finally aware of how tense your shoulders have been. You've managed to take a sleepy stroll through medieval Paris without breaking any laws. At least, not any that anyone has chosen to notice. But as you extinguish your lantern and press shut the wooden door of your lodging, you can't help but wonder, what would happen if someone did decide to break the rules? What would medieval justice actually look like behind closed doors? You wake to the sound of bells again. Paris keeps time with its towers, each church and monastery chiming at slightly different intervals. The resulting echo makes it difficult to know whether it's dawn or merely someone who overslept their turn at ringing the bell rope. Light trickles through the oiled parchment windows, not quite transparent, but enough to glow. You push aside the woolen blanket, Feel the cool of the clay floor under your feet and begin dressing. The inn is quiet. A nun moves silently downstairs, tending to the bread oven, her face lined with soot and prayer. You recall the question that lingered? As you drifted to sleep, what happens if you break the rules, Heror? If someone simply thinks you have? It's not a purely academic question. In 1350, guilt is not always required for punishment. Suspicion can be enough. Suspicion is a flexible concept. You decide to observe the answer firsthand. Not by breaking the law, of course. Just by standing close enough to watch, make your way toward the chatelet, the administrative and judicial center of Paris. It's still early, and the market stalls around the place du Chatelet are just beginning to open. Merchants arrange vegetables and salted fish under striped awnings. A cheese seller hauls out wheels wrapped in cloth. A woman with a shrill voice yells about turnips and thread prices. The Chatelet itself is a grim, squat building with thick stone walls and iron-barred windows that never seem to let light in or out. The guards here are different from the city watchmen, less concerned with politeness, more focused on obedience. You stand at a distance, watching as two men in rough wool tunics are led in through the main gate. One appears drunk. The other is protesting loudly in Latin, no less, which suggests he's a scholar or a cleric. It doesn't seem to help his case. That's the first lesson of medieval justice in Paris. Status matters, but only so far. If you're a university student and there are many in Paris, you're under the jurisdiction of the church, not the city. That means if you commit a crime, you're to be handed over to ecclesiastical authorities, not locked in the Chatelet. In theory, at least, but the lines blur when tempers rise. Sometimes a guard doesn't want to check your student ID or your tonsure if you're a cleric. Sometimes a punch thrown in a tavern trumps all paperwork. The man in Latin disappears inside. The drunk collapses on a bench. A scribe emerges from a side door, clutching a wooden tablet covered in wax the day's charge list, you suspect. It's worth noting that almost everything official in Paris is recorded by hand. Long scrolls, bound ledgers, or wax tablets. Is expensive. Mistakes are scratched out with a knife and sanded smooth. A woman nearby explains not to you, but loudly to no one in particular that her neighbor was dragged here last week for insulting a meat tax collector. Whether not the insult was real or heard by the right ears is unclear. He's not been seen since. You continue your walk toward the Grand Boucherie, the central butcher's district on the Isle de la site near the Seine. The smell is thick, blood, awful, lye soap. But here, too, justice has a presence. A platform is being scrubbed. With buckets of vinegar water, nearby, a stout man with a red cap explains what happened last night. A tanner was caught dumping animal hides into the river after curfew. Illegal disposal? He claims ignorance. The PRVTS men claim otherwise. He'll be fined and likely flogged. Public punishment in Paris is not about reform, it's about visibility. You're meant to see it and remember. Stocks, pillories, floggings, and brandings all performed in open squares with as many witnesses as possible. There's even a public humiliation squad. Men who escort convicts through the streets with signs describing their crimes hung around their necks. You make a mental list. Things that can get you arrested in Paris in 1350. Often without warning or clarity. Walking at night without a lantern. Trading without a license. Selling underweight bread. Failing to pay tolls at city gates. Harboring foreigners without reporting them. Singing lewd songs near churches. Letting pigs wander freely, a real ordinance. Being part of a crowd that looks like a mob. That last one is especially flexible. You wander next to the Rue Saint-Tonner, toward the Hollis Paris's main market district. It's an explosion of noise, clamor, and smells. Dried beans, roasted chestnuts, linen, and live chickens. You stop near a cart of onions, only to be gently but firmly nudged aside by a guardsman making his rounds. He's checking weights. Merchants are required by law to use officially calibrated scales, and weights usually marked with a fleur-de-lis or city seal. If caught using a false weight, a seller might be fined. If caught twice, they could be nailed by the ear to their stall post, literally pinned to their dishonesty. Further on, you see another form of legalism, the bread police. In medieval Paris, bread is the most regulated commodity. Loaves must weigh precisely what the city says they should, and the price is capped, depending on the harvest. Cheating are publicly humiliated or banned from selling sometimes. Forced to parade through the street, carrying their bad bread as a warning. Paris cares deeply about its bread. You sit for a moment near the wall of a church St. Louis-Saint-Leand, observe an arrest unfolding across the square. 2 men in leather aprons are being questioned by 3 guards. One gestures wildly toward a broken cart. They're shouting. Eventually, they are led away, not roughly, but with the clear suggestion that protest is unwise. You can guess what will happen next. They'll be taken to the chatelet, or perhaps the bailliage, the bailiff's office. If the offense is minor, they may be fined. If it's serious, they could be held until a judge convenes. But here's where things become quietly terrifying. You don't always get a trial. The court system is inconsistent, hierarchical, and heavily weighted toward those who can bribe or plead their case in Latin. The PRVT of Paris, a royal official, oversees criminal cases, but he's rarely seen in person. Much of his work is done through deputies, scribes, and local magistrates. Justice is often as much about who you know as what you did. Torture is not routine, but it is legal. In cases of theft, treason, or persistent suspicion, the accused might be put to the question. This usually means being stretched on the rack, having joints crushed, or being subjected to water torture, all in the name of uncovering the truth. Confession is the goal. Innocence is a luxury. You pass a narrow alley where a small crowd has gathered. An older man stands at its entrance, loudly recounting a recent case. A young woman, arrested for theft, denied the charge and was eventually released only to vanish from the city days later. Some say she fled to a convent. Others say the bailiff's men made sure she disappeared. Justice here has gaps. It breathes unevenly. But here's the irony. Most people in Paris are not afraid of arrest because they are criminals. They are afraid because the law is unpredictable. One day, you are a cobbler. The next, someone claims you're sheltering a heretic or using fraudulent coin weights, and the burden of proof shifts onto you. Good luck disproving what someone else merely suggests. You retreat from the bustle and make your way slowly back toward the left bank. The university district is quieter, more academic, and less policed at least during the day.
Students quote Aristotle and argue theology on the street corners.
A monk in brown robes explains canon law to a group of bored teenagers. Even here, the sense of tension is not gannett simply masked by parchment and ink. By the time the shadows grow long again, you've walked nearly the full circuit of central Paris. You haven't broken any laws. You haven't even jaywalked, though. In this time, there are no sidewalks or lines to cross. But still, something lingers. You think of the man arrested in Latin, of the blogging platform, of the law about pigs. You wonder how many people lie tonight in cells, not because they broke rules, but because they were near someone who had. And that leads to a deeper question, if medieval justice is more about appearance than truth. How did anyone ever sleep peacefully in Paris? By now, you've walked the crooked streets of Paris. You've obeyed the lantern laws. Tiptoed around curfew regulations, watched butchers avoid the stocks, and seen how suspicion alone can carry a man through the gates of the chatelet. Still, one crucial piece remains unanswered. What if it's you? What if you find yourself accused or even arrested for something you didn't know was illegal? What if a merchant swears you paid in clipped coin, or a watchman thinks your Latin accent sounds a little too Italian, a little too Florentine, a little too much like someone who might be evading a guild tax? It's not an abstract question in 1350. Mistaken identity, petty jealousies, or bad luck can place anyone merchant, monk, or milkmaid in the path of punishment. So let us say, just for the sake of this quiet stroll, that you are arrested. Not violently, no need for dramatics, but firmly. By 2 guards who tell you your lantern last night was too dim, or that a baker claims you looked like the person who took a crust and walked away. You protest? Of course you do. But protesting loudly is suspicious in itself. You're led across the uneven stones of Rue Saint-Martin, past tired horses and curious children, and through the stone arch of the Chatelet. Side, the air is cooler. Not clean, just damp and heavy with the odor of unwashed stone, old bread, and ink. A scribe asks your name. He writes it down phonetically, most likely into a ledger using a quill dipped in oak gall ink. There's no last name, just a place of origin and a guess at your occupation. You are placed in a holding cell, perhaps simply kept standing in a hallway for hours, depending on how busy the clerk is. No one tells you how long it will take. No one tells you anything. You hear voices behind closed doors, the occasional thump, groan, a cough, silence. Time softens. Then someone emerges, a bailiff or one of his assistants. He wears a robe, too warm for the weather, and gestures for you to follow. You're brought before a small table with a single candle. A man sits on the other side, not unkind, but uninterested. His job is simple: process the accusation, assign blame, and move along. And here, finally, is where things become survivable. Because in medieval Paris, you can still get out of trouble, if you know how. Option 1. Appeal to the clergy if you are a student, clerk, monk, or anyone vaguely affiliated with the church. You might claim benefit of clergy. This means you are under canon law, not civil law, and must be handed over to ecclesiastical courts. These courts are slower, more lenient, and more concerned with confession than punishment. However, proving your status isn't easy. Tonsure, a shaved patch of hair, used to be sufficient. Now, with forgeries and fake monks on the rise, they may demand documents, witnesses, or even a reading test you recite. A psalm in Latin? If you can, you might walk free, or be sent to a monastery for penance, or fined and released with a warning. But if you're caught faking your way into clergy protection, punishment is doubled. A cleric is one of the few non-capital crimes that can lead to branding. Option 2. Pay a fine or obey. Paris runs on money as much as morals. Any minor offenses: disturbing the peace, trading without law license, failing to carry a lantern, be settled with a fine. If you're lucky, the fee is small. A few deniers tournois, maybe the cost of a goose. If you're unlucky, it can run higher echelon if you can't produce the coin on the spot. A bribe, though officially frowned upon, is another route. Couriers, clerks, and scribes have families to feed. A generous gift discreetly offered can speed up your release. No one speaks of it openly. But neither do they look too closely if your pouch is suddenly lighter. The system depends not on fairness tea, on lubrication. Option 3. Find a patron if you're part of a guild, staying in a house affiliated with a powerful family. Might call on your patron. Guilds in 1350 Paris are more than professional associations. They are your legal shield, your social network, and your extended family. A baker caught using cheap flour might escape punishment if his guildmaster intercedes. A tanner with a connection to a royal supplier might never see the inside of a cell. Your host at the inn might speak on your behalf, or perhaps a monk at the abbey where you paid to attend vespers. These small social threads, easily overlooked, are often what save someone from punishment. In a city of thousands, who will vouch for you? Option 4. Swear an oath. Walk one of the simplest, strangest to clear your name is compurgation. You swear an oath before God that you are innocent. That's it. You must have oath helpers. People who will stand beside you, raise their hands, and declare that they believe your word. They don't have to know the truth. Why? That they trust you enough to stake their own soul on it. If you can't find oath helpers, you're in trouble. If you can, you walk free. It's not a trial of evidence. It's a trial of character, of reputation. This, more than anything, reveals the heart of justice in medieval Paris. Truth is communal. You are not what you claim. You are what others claim about you, of course. Some crimes are beyond mitigation. Murder, rape, treason, and heresy, are not fined or forgiven. They are tried in theory, judged swiftly, and punished publicly. Executions in Paris are theatrical. Hangings are most common. Burning is rare, reserved mostly for heresy. Beheading is reserved for the noble, those who paid enough for the dignity. A gallows on the gibbet of Montfaucon holds the rotting bodies of criminals for weeks, if not months, as a warning. It stands tall outside the city walls, visible from miles away. But that is not your fate. The bailiff sighs. The accusation against you is minor. A merchant thought you were someone else. You produced a receipt for your bread. You carry a lantern. Priest confirms you attended Compline. You're free to go. Clerk scribbles a mark into the ledger.
Your name?
Something close. To it, L live forever in the city's parchment records. You are reminded sternly to avoid the Rue de la Vannerie after dusk. You nod, promise, and step back into the daylight. And as you walk slowly through the winding streets, now familiar and still a little grimy, you begin to understand how a person can survive here, not by avoiding trouble, but by understanding the quiet ways to escape it. Later that night, as the bells toll curfew, do you light your lantern again? The city seems both smaller and deeper. Every face you pass, every door you see, holds someone else doing the same thing. Aim to stay on the right side of an invisible line that shifts with the season, the politics, and anthe mood of a scribe. You don't break any laws? Not tonight. But as you cross the Pont Saint-Michel and glance once more at the towers of the Chatelet silhouetted against the moon, you wonder, how many laws are being broken right now? How many people will sleep? Soundly, anyway. You may have noticed it on your first morning. Not a sound, not a sight, Mel. Something sharp, sour, and enliared. Beneath the incense wafting from a chapel, behind the gentle bread smell curling out of an oven even below, the whetstone scent that lingers after a rain raise something darker. You catch it in alleyways, around public wells, near the butcher's stalls, and, strangely, inside some of the wealthier homes. It is the smell of a medieval city, and Paris in the 14th century is no exception. It is not simply unpleasant, is constant, and yet most people never mention it. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about how a city of over 200,000 souls, with no underground sewer system, managed the bodily, animal, and industrial waste of daily life, how it mostly failed. First, you must understand, there is no single authority in charge of sanitation. That role, if it exists at all, is a patchwork of responsibilities shared between neighborhood parish officials, guilds, and occasionally the king's men. When a major street needs cleaning for a royal procession, the rest is up to the citizens. Start with the homes. Most dwellings are built tightly together, bare-framed overhanging the street and in sometimes 4 stories high. The ground floor is typically a shop or workroom. Families sleep above. Chamber pots are common. Prives, less so. When full, chamber pots are either emptied into cesspits. The house is fancy enough to have one directly out the window. Yes, out the window. This is why walking through the narrow lanes of Paris requires attention not only to your feet, but also al sotto, the air above your head. There is a custom, half rule, half courtesy. Guard at low. Cry shouted, seconds before someone empties a pot. Literally, watch out for the water. Tease your warning. Look up, step back. And hope the wind favors you. Sometimes. People forget to shout. Streets as sewers. Paris streets are not clean, they are functional. Down the center of most thoroughfares runs a shallow gutter caniveau. This is not an accident. It's the city's best effort at plumbing. Everything goes in: spilled ale, animal blood, human waste, rain, mud, fish guts, and damned rotting straw. The hope is that the flow will carry it all downhill, eventually into the Seine. Sometimes it does, sometimes it just pools. There are men employed unofficially leered blockages. They use rakes, shovels, and their boots. Their pay is irregular. Their smell is legendary. Some households sweep their filth toward the caniveau. Others build raised thresholds at their doors to keep the filth out. Shoes are thick-soled and often discarded after a season. The idea of hygiene as we understand it simply doesn't exist yet, but complaints do, especially in summer. The guilds in the gutters, certain guilds are responsible for the dirtiest work. Tanners, for instance, who treat animal hides using a mix of urine, lime, and dung, are confined to specific neighborhoods near the Seine. Their waste is so pungent, it can drive fish away for weeks. Butchers, too, have their own zone. Grande Boucherie on the Isle de la Cite. There hundreds of animals are slaughtered each week. Blood runs in rivulets. Offal is either dumped directly into the river or left in carts until someone hauls it out of town to a rendering yard, something the cart doesn't tip over on the way. The Cobblers Guild, the soap makers, and the fuller soul work with chemicals, in processes that produce intense smells. There is no citywide zoning plan. Instead, industries settle near where they're tolerated. Sometimes this leads to conflicts between neighbors. Sometimes it leads to street fights. What about the water? There are public fountains throughout Paris, ornamental, but practical. Water carriers fill buckets and deliver to homes. Wealthier residents have private wells. But none of this water is filtered or treated. Most comes from the Seine, same river into which the city's waste is dumped. Even the public baths, still relatively common in 1350, reuse water through the day. If you're the first customer, you might enjoy something resembling cleanliness. If you're the previous 9, yet people do bathe. Soap is made primarily from animal fats and ashes. Some homes keep herbal sachets vendor. Rosemary mask the air inside. Perfume is not uncommon, especially for the wealthy. But it is applied over unwashed skin more often than not. Municipal cleanings so often, the city organizes a grand effort just before a major holy festival or when the king is expected to visit. Streets are raked, drains are cleared, and foul pits are covered with straw. Notices are posted telling citizens to tidy their doorways, sweep their thresholds, and not empty chamber pots during daylight. But these cleanings are superficial. The deeper filth remains beneath the stones, in the soil, in the walls. Some neighborhoods try their own initiatives. A parish priest might hire boys to scrub the path to church. A taverner might offer ale. Discounts to neighbors who clean the alley behind his shop. These efforts vary wildly in effectiveness. The smell and the saints in a city so full of stench, people turn to more than vinegar and soap. They turn to saints. There are prayers for protection against plague, against spoiled food, and against foul air, which many believe carries illness. The miasma theory of disease, while not yet formalized, is already instinctively believed. Bad air makes people sick. And so, people burn herbs. They hang garlic and wormwood. They light incense in chapels, not always out of piety, sometimes just out of necessity. There's even a quiet superstition that certain smells chase demons away, or attract them. Living with it, what's most striking about all this is not the intensity of the smell, though it is intense, but how people learn to live with it. You notice how Parisians walk differently, how they lift their cloaks just slightly when stepping through a puddle, how they glance up before pausing beneath a window, how mothers hold a cloth to a child's face in certain alleys. You'll notice how inns burn rosemary branches at dusk, how apothecaries leave bowls of mint outside their doors, and how even beggars carry little satchels of crushed pine. It is not that medieval Paris doesn't know it smells, it's that it has built its rhythms around it. And yet, even amid all this, new idea begins to stir in the shadows of university halls and royal councils that perhaps filth isn't just a nuisance. Perhaps it's dangerous. The next section will follow the slow and often futile attempts by Parisians to clean their city, organize waste, and prevent the spread of disease, including the failed ordinances, the rise of street rakers, and the moments when Paris almost invented the public health department. Centuries too soon. This ordinance, like dozens before, it is not new. In fact, it may be a copy of a copy. The city of Paris had been trying to clean itself for nearly 2 centuries by 1350. The problem is, everyone agrees cleanliness is important, but nobody agrees on who should actually do it. Take Rue de la Harpe, for example, a busy street on the left bank, used by students, preachers, and fishmongers alike. The gutter runs clogged with straw, fish scales, bits of wood, and feathers. A street cleaner was supposed to pass through here 3 days ago. He never came. Or he did, and simply walked it. A woman sweeps her doorway with a crude broom. She pushes the waste into the gutter, not out of laziness, but out of habit. It's what her mother did, what everyone does, because the street itself is not sacred. It's a shared dumping ground. A liminal space, not yours, not mine. The king's witch means no one's, so even as new rules are written, the same practices persist. Let's talk about the pigs. There are laws designs against pigs wandering freely in Paris. They're seen as dangerous, dirty, and disruptive. They root through garbage. They trip pedestrians. Once a sow killed a child near the Porte Saint-Honor. In response, city officials banned free-roaming pigs, but enforcement was uneven. A priest might own a prized sow that no guard dares to challenge. A tanner might bribe his way out of a fine. For the poor, a pig is not an animal, it's a walking savings account. Slaughtered in winter and salted and preserved, it feeds a family for weeks. So pigs keep wandering, some with bells around their necks, some without, some were marked with wax, some were marked with nothing at all. They shuffle through alleys, rummaging through refuse, sometimes chased, rarely caught. A man once proposed a city-run pig pen outside the walls, a kind of public pasture. The idea was mocked and quietly shelved. The river a solution and problem, the Seine winding like a slow vein through Paris, has always been a point of pride. It is also the city's most abused feature. The logic is simple. The river carries things away. Waste, offal, dead animals. Drop something in the current and it disappears. But here's the trouble. It doesn't disappear. It moves downstream to someone else's neighborhood. Then in flood season it returns. There are laws forbidding waste dumping in the river. They are ignored. Even the city's own slaughterhouses, located conveniently close to the water, routinely tip blood and entrails straight into the current. At dawn, washerwomen come to beat linen along the banks. By dusk, the same banks hold bits of fur, meat grease, and boot leather. Watermen, those who ferry goods and people across the Seine, sometimes protest. They complain that the stench drives customers away. Their complaints, like the river, are noted, then passed downstream. Enter the rakers. In theory, there are men hired to clean the streets. They are called recluse rakers. They push carts, carry long-handled rakes and wooden shovels. Their job is to clear gutters, move waste to designated pits, and occasionally transport night soil human excrement beyond the city walls. But in practice, their work is inconsistent. Their pay is low. Sometimes they are sick, drunk, or simply overwhelmed. After a festival or market day, the streets are too clogged for their carts to move. In summer, the stench is unbearable. In winter, waste freezes to the stones, so they do what they can. They prioritize the main thoroughfares, the bridges, the areas near churches and city gates, the side alleys. They're on their own. Some rakers sell their services privately, sort of freelance sanitation worker. A wealthy merchant might pay to have his street cleaned more often. A guild might hire one to tidy the front of their meeting hall before an inspection. These arrangements work for the rich. The poor are left to trudge through what remains. The laws keep coming. By 1350, Paris had produced hundreds of ordinances about public hygiene. Some are poetic, some are bizarre. A few highlights: no tanning of hides within 50 paces of a public well, no throwing of dead animals into public fountains, no washing of clothes used for treating leprosy in shared water sources, no stacking of dung heaps higher than 3 feet, no slitting of pigs' throats in view of a parish church, and of course, no emptying of privies during feast days. Each of these rules was written because someone did exactly that, and each law, in turn, is ignored by someone else. The city posts copies of these ordinances in market squares and on church doors. Many citizens can't read them. Those who can often don't care. When the smell gets truly intolerable, a priest might deliver a sermon on cleanliness. It's not as a matter of civic duty, but as a moral warning. Dirt invites sin. Filth is the devil's domain. Rotten air corrupts not only the body but also the soul. Royal interests occasionally, the crown gets involved. Kings rarely walk through Paris, they ride. But when they do, or when foreign dignitaries arrive, the city is ordered to prepare. This means raking, covering puddles, and scenting the air with herbs. In one notable case, royal officials tried to scatter rose petals along the king's route to mask the odor. A breeze blew the petals into the Seine. The king never saw them. The smell remained. The crown briefly considered building underground waste channels, a sort of early sewer. The plan was expensive. The budget was diverted to fortifications instead. The Black Death's influence 2 years before this moment, 1348, the Black Death arrived. It reshaped the entire continent, but in Paris, it also reshaped attitudes toward cleanliness. People noticed that foul air seemed to accompany death, that the sick clustered in low-lying areas with poor drainage. Bad smells preceded outbreaks. Physicians began recommending more rigorous home cleaning, not with soap, but with vinegar, ash, rosemary, and burning juniper. Not to remove germs, but to purify the air. Some even began advocating for waste pits to be dug further from homes, for tannery zones to be relocated, for tighter restrictions on chamber pot disposal. But as the plague faded, so too did the urgency. Old habits returned. Ordinances were archived. Rakers went unpaid. The smell returned, as it always does. Living within the rot, the overwhelmed rakers' people continue to thrive. They find ways to make peace with the stink. They trade in onions, garlic, mint, and vinegar. Children invent games to skip across the cleanest stones. Bakers wake at dawn to cover the smell of night with the scent of bread. Midwives sprinkle herbs before visiting births. Priests carry censers not just for prayer but for defense against the air. People adapt, because they have no other choice. The city has not solved its problem. It has simply learned to live inside it. But something else is happening, slowly, behind the scenes. A new generation of physicians and university thinkers influenced by Arab texts, classical revival, and bitter experience are beginning to link cleanliness with health. Not just moral health, physical health. They are asking strange new questions. Could disease travel not by divine punishment, but by particles in the air? Could a clean street reduce sickness? Could a city be planned differently? So far, their ideas remain just that, ideas. But the seeds are planted. In the final section, we'll follow these earliest stirrings, the glimmers of a modern health system, and trace the people, arguments, and small triumphs that would one day lead to sewers, sanitation, and a city that learned to clean itself. Eventually, we pick up not with a great revelation, not a sweeping reform, but with a trench, shallow, brick-lined, and barely remembered. It was dug sometime in the late 1300s. The date is debated near the Rue Montmartre, just wide enough for a man to walk through hunched. It carried waste runoff from a cluster of butcher shops and tanneries to a covered outlet near the Seine. It was, by all accounts, the first real underground sewer in Paris, and no one wanted to pay for it. The project had been the idea of a local guild master, possibly a cloth merchant, possibly a physician's son. His name doesn't survive in the records. What survives is the complaint. The works disrupt the road and choke trade. Let the river take what the city cannot. Still, the trench remained. It worked more or less. The runoff moved. The stink lessened. One innkeeper praised the miraculous vanishing of the flies. Another, less poetically, said it just meant he didn't have to bribe the rakers anymore. This tiny trench would not change the city overnight. But it planted a thought. Maybe filth could be redirected instead of endured. That idea, once loose, would not vanish. The smell becomes a problem of the mind. It's tempting to see the medieval nose as weaker, dulled by constant exposure. If anything, medieval Parisians were acutely aware of scent. They just classified it differently. Where we might see bad smell equals infection, they saw bad smell equals sin, imbalance, moral decay. But beginning in the late 14th century, influenced by Arab medical texts and returning plague waves, this attitude began to shift. Scholars at the University of Paris began debating airs and vapors. What if foul air wasn't just symbolic, but pathogenic? One medical tract from 1370, one attributed to a physician named Guy de Chalia, argued that rotting meat and blocked drains could produce invisible corruptions in the blood. That's not germ theory, but it's not far off. These ideas remained theoretical for decades. Still, they made their way into civic talk. Suddenly, an open drain was not just an eyesore, it was a potential cause of death. A filthy war throughout the 1400s. We start to see minor but meaningful changes. Waste pits are required to be dug further from wells. Public latrines are constructed, some even with wooden seats, cleaned semi-regularly by appointed staff. Privy inspectors emerge, a rare job that involves walking house to house and ensuring cesspits aren't overflowing. In some neighborhoods, waste carts are assigned schedules, with fines levied on households that fail to cooperate. None of these measures are universal. Most are ignored, but some stick. One neighborhood develops a habit of lime dusting its alleys. After chamber pots are emptied, another forbids animal slaughter within its gates during Lent, when fasting makes stomachs more sensitive. Local priests, long opponents of latrines near churches, begin to relax. After all, a cleaned street outside the chapel means fewer flies during Mass. In 1427, a royal edict is issued not about morality, but about water. The city shall seek to preserve the fountains of Saint Innocent and Saint Marcel, that the people might drink without harm or bitterness. It is the first official acknowledgement by the crown that clean water matters. It doesn't transform Paris, but it acknowledges a truth no one can unsmell. Resistance, of course. Progress brings resistance. Merchants complain that new waste rules slow deliveries. Butchers protest restrictions on blood disposal. Bakers argue that boiling water to wash tools costs more wood than they can afford. Tanners insist that urine-washed hides are traditional. And among ordinary citizens, there's fatigue. Rules change too fast. Inspectors are resented. Fines are unevenly enforced. The rich are warned. The poor are punished. One angry innkeeper, fined for blocking a drain with spoiled cabbage, reportedly yelled, "When the king's horses drop filth in the street, do they pay a coin for it?" The raker who reported him received a bruised eye and no wages. It all begins to turn still. Something subtle begins to change in the Parisian mind. A merchant might still dump refuse at dusk, but now he checks that no one is watching. A maid might still empty a pot out a second-story window, but now she murmurs a prayer before doing so, not out of guilt, exactly, but out of a quiet rising. Fear. Because people have started to notice that the worst smells come before the worst fevers. That the corners where rats cluster are the corners where children sicken. That when the river turns brown, people begin to cough. Doctors haven't yet connected the dots, neither have lawmakers. But on the street and kitchens, in taverns, in whispered talk after Mass, the idea spreads. When the city stinks, death is not far behind. That belief, crude as it may be, becomes the engine of change. The smell of the future by the early 1500s, long after the story we followed here, Paris would begin laying its first planned underground sewers. Primitive, often flooded, and never fully complete, but sewers nonetheless. Hospitals would introduce stricter hygiene protocols. Markets would be paved. Fountains protected. New waste pits designed. The word sanitation would not yet exist. But its spirit had taken root. And that route began in the 1300s, not with kings or scholars, but with those who lived closest to the filth, the raker who finally convinced a guild to clear their alley twice per week, the apothecary who told her neighbors to boil river water. After the cows died, the mother who sprinkled vinegar where her child played, not knowing why, but feeling it mattered. Today, you walk these same streets, though cleaner, brighter, and paved, but the old bones of the city still whisper. A cobblestone here, a low archway, they are remnants of a city that once reeked, that once emptied its waste into its feet and prayed not to slip on it. Paris eventually learned to clean itself, but not because a genius declared it necessary. It learned because too many people refused to live in the stink any longer. And so, the next time you pass a gutter and don't flinch, or sip from a tap without fear, remember the centuries of failure that came first. Wonder, what do we still endure today? Simply because we haven't yet smelled the cost of avoiding it. You smell it before you see it. At dawn in a narrow street off Rue Saint-Honore, Behind a wooden shutter painted with a faded sheaf of wheat, the scent of bread floats into the air like incense. Warm, thick, a little sour writ curls through the air, rising above the stink of horses, the dust of stone, and the mutter of grocers setting up stalls. The baker is already hours into his day. He rose before dark, raked coals from the communal oven hearth, kneaded dough in silence, and now, as bells toll for early mass, he slides loaves from the peel onto wooden racks, round bowls, long pane dorge, heavy dark rye for the workers. A few pane de metal, made of mixed grains more affordable, harder, and more filling. What you may not know is this. In 14th century Paris, the baker is not just a tradesman. He is a pillar of civic stability, and the price of that loaf in his hands is set not by him, but by law. Welcome to the regulated, underappreciated, and often precarious life of a medieval Parisian baker. The bread law of the land bread is not just food. It is survival. For most of the population, especially the poor, bread is the central component of every meal. Richer households may add meat, eggs, or cheese, but for the majority, a piece of bread dipped in broth or eaten with garlic is the day's substance. As such, Parisian authorities, beginning with the PRVT de Paris and later, royal oversight, established detailed regulations about bread, size, and weight. Loaves must match specified weight standards. Pain to do deniers must weigh more than a pain dune denier, regardless of how the grain changes price. Price controls. Bakers are prohibited from charging above a set price. If the cost of grain rises, the size of the loaf shrinks, not the price. Ingredients: no fillers. Bakers must use proper grain wheat, rye, or barley. Adulterating dough with dust, sawdust, or chalk is a criminal offense. These rules are posted at market crosses, near church doors, and sometimes carved onto stone columns. Inspectors, known as les bowlingers, jurors, sworn bakers, are responsible for checking that other bakers follow the rules. It sounds tidy. It rarely is. The communal oven and its politics. Few bakers have their own ovens. Fuel is expensive wood, especially to avoid each household needing its own fire. Neighborhoods often share a communal oven. These ovens are maintained by the city or by the local seigneurial lord, and bakers pay a fee to use them. In some quarters, the right to use the oven is a hereditary privilege. In others, it's auctioned seasonally. For independent bakers, this can be a source of friction. If a rival baker's family controls oven access, your bread may go and last risking underbaking or burning. If you're late or disliked or owe a fee, you may wait hours. Oven politics are quiet but fierce. Favors are exchanged. Grudges linger. Some bakers even sleep near the oven on busy nights, guarding their place in line. The Guild of Bakers and its Secrets by 1350. Parisian bakers are members of a semi-formal guild, though not as tightly organized as the weavers or tanners. Still, the guild enforces standards, trains apprentices, and mediates disputes. Begins as an apprentice, often at age 12 or 13, kneading dough and hauling flour sacks. After years of labor, he may become a journeyman, allowed to bake under a master's watch. Only after proving his skill, loyalty, and moral conduct can he become a master baker, permitted to open his own shop. Guild secrets are passed down. Techniques for keeping dough warm in winter. Tricks to revive old yeast, which millers water their grain, or to buy flour after the bridge tolls rise. The guild also protects its members, sometimes too zealously. Bakers caught undertaking bread are sometimes shielded from punishment. But those who undercut prices, bakes on Sundays, or uses another guild's oven without permission, those are swiftly punished. Loyalty is demanded, especially in times of scarcity. The watchful eyes of the wheat monitors grain in Paris is life, and its price is political. The grain supply is tracked obsessively. Royal officials count sacks, inspect mills, and patrol roads to prevent hoarding. When grain grows scarce, bread. Riots are not uncommon. Bakers are the first to be blamed, sometimes justly. A baker might short a loaf, overcharge a poor widow, or mix cheaper barley into wheat flour. Other times unfairly. A baker may follow every rule and still be dragged into the street by a hungry mob who sees bread behind his window and assumes he's hiding it. In especially tense years, city guards are posted outside large bakeries during early morning hours. Their job? Keep order, ensure fair distribution, protect the ovens and the bakers from their own customers. The baker becomes, in such moments, an accidental symbol of inequality. Punishment by loaf, when a baker is found guilty of cheating. Customers. The punishment is theatrical. One common method, the bread parade. The accused is tied to a cart, his substandard bread piled in front of him, sometimes worn on a necklace. A crier reads the charges. The crowd jeers. He is paraded through the city before being fined or jailed. In extreme cases, such as repeated cheating during famine, year's bakers are put in the stocks. Rarely, they are beaten. Once, in 1312, a baker was allegedly executed after selling loaves made from ground chalk and moldy flour. But more often, shame is enough. The baker's reputation is his currency. Lose it and no one returns. There are too many others too. Many ovens, too many mouths. The women who bake, not all bakers are men. In fact, many smaller household bakers, especially those selling from their doorstep, are women. Some are widows of bakers, allowed to continue the trade. Others are independent, baking small loaves for neighbors or reselling bread from larger ovens. Their work is informal, often undocumented, and occasionally frowned upon by the male-dominated guild. But in practice, they are essential. In poorer districts, where guild shops are rare and market days are few, these women provide daily bread, sometimes literally from their home hearth. They face the same inspections, the same risks, but less protection. If a male baker is accused of cheating, he may call on guild allies. If a woman is accused, she must defend herself alone. And yet, many succeed, becoming fixtures in their neighborhoods, known not just for their loaves, but also for their gossip, remedies, and sharp tongues. So how do you avoid offending a baker? It's surprisingly simple. Don't ask for more. Then your coin will buy. Don't complain if today's loaf is darker than yesterday's. Don't accuse them of hoarding unless you've seen the flour sacks. Don't try to bargain. The price is not theirs to change. For heaven's sake, don't show up late on baking day and expect warm bread. If you're polite, the baker may save you a crust and prized for soaking up broth. If you're trusted, they might tell you when the next flour cart is expected. If you're lucky, you might learn their trick. A pinch of last week's dough, fermented just long enough, makes today's loaf sing. But if you offend them, expect your loaf to be slightly underbaked, slightly too crusty, slightly thin. Nothing you can prove. Everything you'll remember. In the next section, we'll descend deeper into the daily rhythms of the bakehouse explorer, the hidden dangers of flour fires. It's the power struggles between millers and bakers, and how bread riots began, not with shouts, but with a missing cart at dawn. The baker's day begins long before the city stirs. Well before the first bell tolls from Notre Dame, long before the fishmongers roll their carts into position, or the friars murmur morning prayers, the baker is kneeling beside embers, not in prayer, but in calculation, because timing is everything. The oven must be hot, but not too hot. The dough must be risen, but not over-risen. The flour must be dry, but not scorched. One mistake, and the entire batch representing days of labor and hard-earned grains, ruined. What you're entering now is not a shop. It is a system of ritual and risk, equal parts chemistry, choreography, and controlled danger. And it begins with flour. Flour. The most dangerous powder in Paris, you wouldn't think it at first. Flour is soft, light, and pale as milk. But in a medieval bakehouse, it is also highly flammable. Not the flour itself, exactly, but the dust. A fine cloud of airborne flour particles, combined with open flame and poor ventilation, can ignite explosively. In a cramped bakehouse with a low ceiling, a stray ember or spark from the oven could cause a sudden fireball. There are no fire brigades. The baker knows this, which is why every movement is careful. The flour is kept in tightly covered bins. Its kneading area is swept often, and the fire is never stirred when the dough is being sifted nearby. Apprentices are trained early to keep their mouths shut while measuring flour. Single cough could raise a cloud, a kneading bench. the center of the world once the flour is weighed and the yeast mixed, usually a sour. Living leaven kept from the previous day's dough, the real work begins. Kneading is not gentle, it is labor. Arms and shoulders are pressed into service, hour after hour, against the sticky mass. The bench is heavy, often stained with years of dough and crusts that never quite scrub it away. Wooden bowls, rough spatulas, and cloth surround it in a sort of functional chaos. The baker knows every knot in the wood, every slope of the grain. He or she can tell by touch when a dough is too wet or too slow to rise. They adjust instinctively: a little more flour, a slightly longer rest, a rearranged baking order. There are no timers, no thermometers, just observation, repetition, and intuition. The oven, heat, discipline, and scarcity, the heart of the operation, is the stone oven, often domed and fired with wood. It takes hours to heat properly. A good baker will test the temperature not by numbers, but by tossing in a handful of flour. If it flashes brown too quickly, it's too hot. If it doesn't brown at all, it's too cold. Somewhere in between the perfect window of fire, the loaves must go in. Too soon, and the crust sets before the dough can rise. Too late, and the heat has faded. Bakers use a long-handled paddle, the peel, to slide loaves in and out. It's a skill that takes years. Each loaf must be rotated at the right time, placed just so to catch the radiant heat. The oven is too hot to reach inside, so precision from the doorway is crucial. And if the oven is shared, the challenge multiplies. You wait your turn. You learn to bargain with other bakers, to predict when a batch will be pulled, to smooth over quarrels before they turn physical. A missed bake is a missed income. A spoiled batch, a week of hunger. At the millers and their quiet tyranny, if bakers are the backbone of the city, millers are the gatekeepers of their livelihood. Flour doesn't just appear, it must be milled. And in Paris, most flour comes from watermills operated under strict royal license. These mills, often perched along the Seine or its tributaries, control both access and pricing. Miller-baker relations are often tense. A miller might delay a delivery, reduce a baker's usual allotment, or raise prices subtly. The reason might be real poor grain. Flood conditions are simply political. Some millers are bribed to favor certain bakers. Others are accused of adulterating flour with husk or stone dust to stretch their product. A single bad shipment can spoil an entire day's bake. Worse yet, in times of famine, grain hoarding becomes a whispering crime. Flour wagons are hijacked. Guards are bribed. Accusations swirl. The baker, once again, is caught in the middle. Customers demand bread. Millers demand payment. The city demands compliance. There is rarely enough flour to satisfy all three. The riot that began with an empty shelf, bread riots in medieval Paris, do not start with banners or slogans. They begin in silence. Mother walks to her usual bakery and sees the shutters closed. A boy runs to the market and returns empty-handed. A priest finds the bread table at the hospital empty. The murmurs start. The baker is hiding loaves. The guild is keeping flour for the rich. The millers are selling to foreigners. One hungry crowd becomes two. They march to the baker's door, sometimes politely, sometimes not. If he's wise, he gives them what he has. If he hesitates, he may be pulled into the street. In 1306, a baker's shop near the Porte Saint-Denis was stripped bare in under 30 minutes. The baker's son was beaten. His wife was blamed for hiding. Flour in the bedclothes. Nothing was ever proven. The shop never reopened. These episodes are not common, but they live in memory. Every baker knows famine makes mobs. So even in good times, most keep a few extra loaves behind the counter, not for profit, but for peace. The ethics of shortening a loaf, even the best baker faces temptation. When the grain is tight, the dough can be stretched. A touch more water, a touch more rye, a slightly smaller weight, crustier bake to mask a thinner crumb. But these decisions carry risk. Inspectors from the guild may arrive without notice, weighing loaves and sniffing them for ash, grit, or improper fermentation. Customers may notice too, and one suspicion takes root, it's hard to shake. Most bakers occasionally bend the rules, not to grow rich, but to survive. A pregnant wife, a broken cart axle, a stolen flour sack. These are not excuses, they are reasons. The margin between subsistence and ruin is narrow, a baker once said. The loaf may be short today, but if I bake none tomorrow, what good was honesty? It's a hard logic. But in the medieval economy, sometimes that's the only kind. Bread and trust in all this. The fire risk, the flour politics, the price inspections. The riot rumor something strange happens. The baker becomes a quiet symbol of trust. They see him daily, white-dusted, smokes, mirrored, arm-deep in dough. They hear his early footsteps, smell his labor long before they wake. Good baker steady, fair and calms. Something even the king struggles to command. Loyalty. He doesn't just feed people. He reassures them that Paris will still be here tomorrow. In the next and final section, we'll explore how bread became both a symbol of justice and rebellion, from royal proclamations to whispered prayers, from sacred loaves to public punishments, and how even the humblest bull could tip the scales. Of power in medieval Paris, stand quietly in a Paris street around the year 1355. You'll hear the voices of merchants haggling, the clang of church bells, and the rhythmic whir of a spinning wheel from an open window. But underneath it all is another sound, so regular it often goes unnoticed. The soft knock of bread loaves against wood. It's the baker again arranging today's bake in the window. Round loaves, crusty ridges, the occasional misshapen bun. He places them with care, not for appearance, but for order. Because in this moment in history, bread is not just food, it is justice. The king's loaf by the 14th century. Paris, capital of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, had made bread into law. Royal edicts describe it not merely as nourishment, but as a social contract. Every citizen, no matter their wealth, is expected to have access to a fair loaf at a fair price. And when this compact is broken, whether by bakers, millers, merchants, or famine, it is seen as a breach of moral order. This is why the crown maintains such obsessive control over bread pricing. A table of weights and measures, updated regularly, is published and posted publicly, often attached to market crosses or carved into stone near fountains. It lists not just what a loaf should cost, but how much it should weigh, down to the ounce, given current grain prices. Bakers are expected to adjust their loaves accordingly. Raise the price? Illegal. Skimp on weight? Punishable. Bread, like the law, must be balanced. The city doesn't just want bread to be affordable, it wants bread to be predictable. Want to bring an unstable world of war, disease, and crop failure. That predictability is a form of peace. Public punishment by pastry when bakers fail to meet expectations. Justice was designed to be public-hand, theatrical. Imagine a wooden cart trundling through the city. Atop it stands a man-flower, still clinging to his sleeves, holding an undersized loaf above his head. He is jeered, mocked, and sometimes pelted with crumbs or rotten turnips. This is the baker's shame parade, a common punishment for deceitful baking. Sometimes the offending loaves were hung around the baker's neck like pendants. Might be placed on his chest. This man cheated the people's stomachs. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about symbolism. The city wanted people to see that bread mattered, that cheating the scale was as serious as cheating a coin. That bakers who betrayed trust would be made an example of. In some cases, if the crime was repeated or done during famine, the punishment escalated. Public stocks, confiscation of goods, or banishment from the guild. But in the eyes of the public, no punishment hurt more than being distrusted. If your neighbors believed your bread was false, you might as well board your door. Sacred bread's power extended beyond commerce and into the divine. In medieval theology, bread is central to the most sacred Christian ritual, the Eucharist. During Mass, ordinary bread becomes the body of Christ. Not symbolically, but literally, in the minds of many believers. This created a powerful dichotomy. There was holy bread, consumed in quiet reverence, and everyday bread purchased in noisy markets. But the two were not wholly separate. Many believed that the morality of the baker influenced the bread, that an honest, God-fearing baker produced purer food, that a sinful or dishonest baker might pass along their corruption into the loaf. Some devout households sprinkled holy water on loaves before slicing. Others refused to eat bread baked during eclipses or funerals. Few even recited prayers before kneading dough, invoking protection against mold, fire, or theft. The baker, then, was not just a worker, but a quiet steward of spiritual health. Bread riots, and the whisper of rebellion despite its sacred and legal status, bread also became a symbol of unrest. Whenever grain prices rose too high, or when shipments failed to arrive, the first response was not always political light, it was practical. People stopped baking, and they started complaining. Then, eventually, they started marching. Bread riots were rarely coordinated. They didn't involve manifestos or banners. Instead, they were eruption events, fueled by hunger and the visible proof of inequality. Imagine this. It's winter. The mill has failed to deliver flour to several neighborhoods. You've heard rumors that a wealthy merchant bought up sacks in advance? Your local baker has none for sale, only the most expensive, finely sifted loaves. You see a cart trundling toward the Hotel de Ville. It's loaded with flour. You and your neighbors stop it. You argue. Driver is nervous. Someone grabs a sack. It splits. The cart tips. Within minutes, the flour is scattered and scooped into cloaks and sacks. The city guard arrives too late. The crown hears about it the next day. An edict is issued. Nothing changes. And so the memory of that riot, of that moment of hunger, turned action lingers like the scent of burned crust. When the bakers went silent, not all protests were loud. Occasionally, bakers themselves joined in quiet resistance. In 1372, during a bitter winter of poor harvests and trade disputes, bakers in several Paris neighborhoods simply stopped baking. Not a riot, not a strike officially, just a silence. Their shops remained closed, the ovens cold. Signs posted on doorways read, "No flour, no fire, no bread." City officials tried to coerce them. Threats were made. But without flour there could be no punishment, only waiting. Eventually, grain shipments resumed. The prices stabilized. But the event became a quiet lesson for the crown. The city's peace was baked daily, and the bakers held the peel. How not to offend a medieval? Baker revisited back to that question. If you're in 14th century Paris and you want your daily bread, your warm, crusty, golden bowl, how do you avoid offending the one person who can make it happen? Simple. Pay on time and don't haggle. Prices are fixed for a reason. Turn your bread bin clean. It's a small kindness that bakers remember. Don't gossip about short loaves unless you're sure. Rumors ruin reputations. Thank the apprentice, not just the master. His blisters fed your children. Never, ever block the path to the communal oven that's asking for war. If you follow these, the baker will remember you and in hard times, maybe save you a loaf. Not out of charity, but out of quiet, flour-dusted respect. The end of the loaf's reign, eventually centuries later, bread would lose its sacred place. Industrialization would bring metal ovens, measured yeast, and factory-milled flour. Guilds would fall. The old rituals would fade. Bread would become an object, again a product, a choice, a brand. But for centuries it was none of those things. It was bread. The daily promise that no matter how cold or chaotic or unjust the world became, something warm would be waiting, pulled from fire, shaped by hand, and offered with quiet dignity. And maybe it's worth wondering, what else do we take for granted today? Once enforced by shame, fire, and sacred flour, the night in medieval Paris begins before the sun sets, long before the final streaks of orange vanish behind. The rooftops' shutters begin to close. Market stalls are disassembled, candles are pinched out, alleys that bustled with shouting vendors and squawking chickens fall into cautious quiet. And as darkness begins to pool between stones and doorways, a quiet figure emerges, lantern in hand, walking slowly along the Rue Saint-Antoine, the night watchman. Clad in heavy wool, a round cap pulled low, and a cudgel at his side. He is neither soldier nor priest, but he is feared in his own way. Not for violence, but for what he sees. Because in this fragile, flickering city, only one kind of man stays. Awake while others sleep, the kind who has reasons to watch and reasons not to speak. The making of a watchman. In theory, anyone could become a watchman. You didn't need wealth, you didn't need a title, but you needed something else. Something harder to define, a quiet loyalty to order, even when that order was fragile or arbitrary. Most watchmen were drawn from veterans, older apprentices, or trusted servants of guildmasters. They were paid modestly, sometimes in coin, sometimes in bread, sometimes only with lodging in a storage room or stable loft. Their job was simple: keep the peace. But peace, in 14th century Paris, was not simple at all. Suspicious of the dark, medieval Paris feared the night. It wasn't just superstition, though, that helped. The dark was the realm of thieves, spirits, and sins too shameful for daylight. But more practically, it was when crimes happened: stabbings, over dice games, quiet betrayals between lovers, bread stolen from cellars, and insults whispered at locked doorways. So, every evening, shortly before dusk, the bell of St. Chaclabatory rang out a signal known as the cloche de curfew. Curfew. At that moment, taverns were too close. No candles or lamps could be carried outdoors without reason. Gates to the city began to close, and ordinary citizens were expected to stay indoors. Only priests on duty, city messengers, and watchmen were permitted to walk the streets. This wasn't merely custom, it was enforced by law. Those caught outside after curfew without proof of purpose could be detained, fined, or beaten.
Here's someone?
Had to do the catching. The duties of the night watch: each watchman was assigned a route, often no longer than a few streets. He would patrol these from sundown until cock, roughly 10 to 12 hours, depending on the season. He carried a staff for defense, a lantern if permitted, a rope or whistle to signal others, and occasionally a written list of expected disturbances, names of suspected drunkards, known quarrelers, or streets where disputes had been brewing. But it wasn't all danger. Much of the job was listening to the clatter of hooves at an unusual hour, to the hiss of boiling water from a back window, to the groan of shutters opening when they shouldn't, to the rustle of footsteps trying not to echo. The watchman was not judge or executioner. He was the city's ear, and yet often what he heard he could not report. Secrets at every turn in a tightly packed medieval city. With wooden houses stacked like firewood and gossip drifting through the rafters, no one is ever truly alone. Least of all the man hired to walk silently past their doors. The watchman knew too much. He knew which baker beat his apprentices. He knew which priest visited the tavern girls. He knew that the merchant who sold golden candlesticks out of the Latin Quarter sometimes dropped his accent and paid debts in foreign coin. But knowledge was a dangerous thing, especially for someone who couldn't afford a locked gate. So he kept his mouth shut. He saw a drunk nobleman's son pissing in the street, he looked the other way. If he found a bloody dagger in a ditch, he kicked it into the gutter and moved on. If he heard a whisper about rebellion or worse, heresy, he let it pass like wind through leaves. Not because he didn't care, because he knew what happened. Two watchmen who talked too much. The price of knowing you may think the city would reward a vigilant night guard. Sometimes, yes. A watchman who caught a thief red-handed or intervened in a tavern brawl before blood spilled might be praised, even tipped. But too much enthusiasm? Too many reports that raised suspicion? You see, a city that relied on unofficial arrangements, favors, silences, could not afford a man who noticed everything. If you named too many names, you made enemies. If you arrested the wrong drunk, he turned out to be someone's cousin. If you confiscated a bundle of coins, someone claimed they had been a tithe. So, experienced watchmen learned a trick. They walked heavily. Their boots announced their approach long before they reached a street corner. That way, trouble had time to disappear. The guilty could melt into the doorways, and the baker could drag the flour sack back indoors. And when the sun rose, the watchman could say honestly, nothing to report. When the watchman does speak still, sometimes silence failed. When a corpse was found, throat slit in a gutter, eyes still opened, the question was always the same. Where was the watchman? When a bakery burned to ash at midnight, neighbors asked, "Didn't the watchman smell the smoke?" When coins were stolen from a chapel, when a horse went missing, when blood was found on the church steps, sighs turned to ward. The man who had been paid to patrol, he might have seen something, might have heard something, might have known too. Much. And yet, nothing was said, because the night was long, the pay was short. And the baker down the street was already muttering that the watchman spent too much time outside his daughter's window, so he lowered his head, spoke only when summoned, and prayed he wouldn't be blamed for the next silence. Where shadows overlap at the edge of the Isle de la Cite, where the narrow stone bridge connects the center of Paris to the left bank, the watchman stops. He leans on his staff, listens. The bells of St. Severin toll, slowly the hour before dawn. Far above in the palace tower, the king sleeps. Far below, in the stone cells beneath the chatelet, the prisoners do not. The city lies still, but not quiet. There's always a cry somewhere. It's always the creak of a shutter. Cough behind. Great. The drip of something from a rooftop. The smell of something burning. The sharpness of a blade sheathed just out of sight. The watchman knows it all, but he'll say nothing. Not tonight. The deeper into night you go, the more the city begins to unravel. The noises change. The silence thickens. And a watchman, even one trained, trusted, and used to this rhythm, begins to sense something unsettling. Not fear exactly, but a sense that the city has become someone else, a different Paris. One made of hollow alleyways, feral glances, and the sound of your own breathing bouncing back at you from stone walls. This is the world of the watchman's second shift, the hours after midnight, when darkness gets heavier and what's left awake is either very lonely, very desperate, or very dangerous. The dogs that roamed without masters, they were not strays, not exactly. Every part of medieval Paris had its dogs kept for hunting, guarding, rat-catching, or just companionship. But there were always those who lived between categories, half-fed, half-wild, once-sowned animals that lingered in butcher alleys and dung heaps. By night, these dogs ruled. They roamed in loose packs, moving along known scrap routes. They fought each other for spoiled entrails. They slept under carts and sometimes rarely, but never turned hostile. Watchmen knew better than to make eye contact. A growl in a side street wasn't a warning. It was a test. Carry bread crusts if you could. Throw it behind you, not in front. And have you ever seen two dogs standing silently at a crossroads? Staring down an alley? Turn around? Quietly. It wasn't superstition. The dogs remembered who kicked them, who chased them. And in the deepest hours of the night, they remembered the smell of your fear. The sewers that weren't Paris in the 14th century did not yet have an underground sewer system. Instead, it had open ditches narrow, winding trenches carved along the sides of certain streets, meant to carry refuse and rainwater away from the center of town. In theory, in practice, they clogged, overflowed. At night, they filled with shadow. The smell was permanent. Watchmen learned to breathe through the mouth, not too deeply, not too often. But the worst part wasn't the stench. It was what fell in. People drunk, injured, or chased sometimes slipped into those ditches. Some got out. Others did not. The watchman's job, when he found such a thing, was to raise a cry, call for help, and wait. He was not expected to retrieve the body. He had no rope, no training, no reward. Just the memory of something pale, half submerged, drifting toward. A great and a name he'd never get to know. When the job became a curse, not everyone believed the watchman was a protector. In certain quarters, especially among older women, beggars, and those born under particular moons, the watchman was seen as an omen. He walked the night. He carried a light. He saw things no one else saw. That was enough. In some neighborhoods, doors were double-bolted when the watchman passed. Spits were made behind curtains. Prayers were whispered. Small tokonza. Twist. Of wool, a tiny braid of straw, a pebble marked with soot were tossed in his path to protect the home from the shadow's echo. He wasn't hated, just avoided, and he knew it. So most watchmen walked quietly, stepped lightly, and looked away from certain upper windows, where lamplight flickered too rhythmically to be accidental. The places no one wanted to patrol, every watchman, no matter how seasoned, had a street he hated. Sometimes it was a dead-end alley that curved into itself, where noise didn't carry and shadows pooled unnaturally. Sometimes it was a street to quiet where even the dogs didn't linger, and even the horrors kept to the corners. Some watchmen believed certain roads were haunted. Others just called them bad stretches. There were stories. A man whose lantern blew out every time he passed a shutter with 3 vertical slats. A barking sound that followed your footsteps, always 2 paces behind. A child's laugh was heard near the Maisonneuve Pignons, even after the plague took every child on that block. The city didn't believe these tales officially. But when assigning patrols, the chatelet clerk always paused before scribbling those names on a chart. Sometimes he scratched out one name and wrote another. And never, ever did the same watchman walk the Rue de l'Arbalete 2 nights in a row. Deals in the dark watchmen were expected to enforce curfew, to question anyone walking at night, to stop fights, to report suspicious gatherings. But in truth, most watchmen brokered silence more than they enforced law. They were the hinge between the city's written order and its lived reality. So when they saw a pair of nobles emerge from a hidden gate, laughing, cloaked, clearly drunk, they didn't ask questions. If they passed a baker's apprentice making an off-hours flour run, they nodded and moved on. They knew which priests took their mistresses through side doors, made after-hours visits to plague houses, which stables paid coin not to be listed on tax scrolls. In return, they received small favors: a sausage wrapped in cloth, still warm from a tavern, a handful of dried plums from a grocer's wife, a word in the right ear when someone from the chatelet came asking questions. It wasn't corruption. It was the only way the job worked. A night watchman who enforced every rule would last 2 weeks, maybe less. A watchman who knew what to see and what to overlook, he might last years. And then there were the ones who vanished. Not all watchmen retired. A few simply disappeared. No one asked too many questions. Maybe they left. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they fell into a ditch or walked into a deal they shouldn't have seen. Maybe they were remembered too well by someone whose name had never made it into the watchbook. In 1347, a watchman named John du Marche vanished from his post near the Rue des Rosiers. His lantern was found on a windowsill, still burning. His cudgel lay on the ground, clean. No blood, no footprints, was never found. 3 years later, his name was still muttered whenever the wind blew strangely through that quarter. A baker claimed he saw John's shadow in the mist. A priest said he heard footsteps on empty stones. Eventually, no one was assigned to that street. It became another stretch. No one patrolled. What the watchmen left behind, most night watchmen were poor. They died without records, without gravestones, without heirs. Their lanterns were reused. Their wool cloaks passed to the next man. Their names vanished into scribbled payrolls and unfinished ledgers. But their paths remained. Every street still bore the mark of the man who once walked it nightly, his boot scuffs, his habits, his favorite wall to lean against while listening to distant dogs. And in a strange way, he shaped the city's sleep, not by force, not by justice, but by quiet repetition, a presence, a rhythm. The idea that someone anonymous and a little tired was out there, still walking, even while you dreamed. In the final section, we'll follow one final night on patrol, a city on edge, trail of odd clues, a choice between justice and silence, and how a humble watchman nearly changed the course of Paris by doing nothing at all. It was the kind of cold that made the city sound hollow. February of 1358. The Seine was rimmed with ice. The fishmongers hadn't opened their stalls in days. No one lingered outside if they could help it. The firewood sellers grumbled louder than the priests. And from the Rue des Lavendes to the gate at Port Saint-Denis, Paris was sleeping with one eye open. The city was anxious, and no one quite said why. But the watchman knew. The city under tension. The harvest the previous year had been poor. Grain prices were rising. Rumors drifted down from the north that the king's advisors were planning another. Taxor had already issued one in secret. The merchants were angry, the butchers were angrier, and the bakers were acting jumpy, giving half-loaves to regulars without a word. That's when you knew something was wrong, when bakers got quiet. Even worse, strange visitors had been seen in the cloisters near St. Martin. Riders from outside Paris, men who didn't remove their gloves when they passed through a doorway, that sort of thing. The bells still rang on time, the curfew still sounded. But in the night, the city's breathing felt different. That week, watchmen were told to be extra vigilant, extra quiet, and not to stop any messenger riders, no matter the hour. But for one man, a veteran watchman of nearly 9 years, something about that didn't sit right. His name, half remembered, was Etienne. Etienne of the Rue Bar du Bec. Etienne notices the pattern. Etienne wasn't young anymore. He had a slight limp earned years earlier, slipping on a butcher's spill. His lantern shook a little when he walked. Hearing in one ear wasn't what it used to be. But he was known for 2 things. He rarely spoke unless he had to. He noticed patterns. That night, as he began his rounds, he counted 5 shutters closed that were usually left open. He passed the baker on Rue des Nonnes, and the man avoided his eyes. He saw no dogs, not even the little black one that followed his boots some nights. But the most unusual thing? The bell of St. Laurent didn't toll at midnight. That hadn't happened in years. Bells were as reliable as breathing. If one missed its mark, the others would repeat it, cover the gap, and reset the hour. This time, silence. Etienne stood still in the street, watching frost gather on the cobbles. Somewhere in the darkness, a rooster crowed early, behind. The Hotel St. Paul, he saw 3 figures in dark cloaks slip through a side passage that didn't lead anywhere public. He didn't follow. He simply noted it. The quietest night for the rest of his watch, Etienne walked the usual route but made one small change. He passed each of the bell towers. Not to stop, just to listen. Each tower had its own rhythm, its own keeper. He knew the sounds intimately, the groaning pulley of Saint-Jacques, the faint iron scrape of Saint-Severin, and the peculiar double ring of Saint-Jacques. But that night, he heard only 3. The rest silent. That wasn't illness. That wasn't bad weather. That was intentional. He didn't know what it meant. But he knew silence like a monk knew his breviary. It had a shape, a contour. It was never empty. Not in Paris. This silence. It was planned. What the watchman did, he had 2 options. He could report the missing bells. He could march up to the Chatelet guard post and tell them something was amiss. Or he could do what he'd always done, stay quiet and keep walking. But Etienne wasn't a young man anymore. Didn't expect promotion. Didn't fear punishment. He only feared one thing, regret. So he made a 3rd choice. He walked a route he hadn't been assigned in years through the Rue Viel du Temple, past the shadows of the old wall, down to the ancient stone gate near the Church of the Holy Innocents. There he found something he hadn't expected. A cart, 2 horses, and 5 armed men, quietly speaking in Flemish language not often heard in Paris unless politics was afoot. On the cart, barrels. Etienne had seen enough war, enough siege tactics, to recognize the shape and smell of black powder. The decision not to speak it would be easy to say that Etienne rushed to report it. But he didn't. He stood there, under a sliver of moon, lantern low, breath quiet, and listened. What he realized then, and what he later never admitted, was that the bell silence was cover. For movement. For smuggling. Sabotage. The barrels were destined not for storage, but for destruction. And the guard post. He realized he couldn't trust it. Not that night. Perhaps not ever again. So Etienne didn't report it. Instead, he went home. Carefully, silently, and the next day, when asked about his patrol, he said only the bells slept, and so did I. What happened next? Within a week, whispers began that a plot had been foiled, that an attack on a certain royal convoy had been narrowly avoided, that a group of saboteurs had vanished after being spotted near the city walls. No one connected it to the night of missing bells. No one asked Etienne. And he didn't offer anything. He just kept walking, night after night, until his limp grew worse, until his lantern shook too badly to stay lit, until the next man took. his place. The final quiet lesson Etienne's story was never written down. There are no plaques, no songs. It's just a rumor that one night a watchman noticed the city go too quiet, and instead of calling for help, he waited. And because he waited, someone else stepped in. Someone with more power, more name, and more ability to act without being erased. He was forgotten. But the bells rang again the next night. And Paris is suspicious, brittle, frostbitten, Paris-endered, because of a man who knew how to walk, when to stop, and most importantly, when to keep a secret. Step into medieval Paris and inhale carefully. The city was not a place of perfumes or potpourri, despite the grandeur of its churches and the pride of its universities. Paris was, for most of its medieval life, a place of smells. Some were tolerable, baking bread, tallow candles, and dried herbs wafting from windows, but most were not. Boiling skins, piles of rotting turnips, horse dung baking in summer heat, human waste trickling between stones. The air was thick with the reminders of bodies, labor, and livestock. All crowded together within walls meant more for defense than hygiene. And yet, despite this, Paris did not drown in its own filth. Why? Because of a class of workers most history books politely leave out the ones whose job it was to deal with what everyone else preferred to ignore. They were called many things: rakers, gong farmers, gutter wives, muckmen, piss collectors, dung haulers. But they shared one trait. They cleaned so others didn't have to. The filth economy by the 1300s, Paris had roughly 200,000 residents. That's a staggering number for a medieval city. More people meant more food meant more waste. And more waste meant, well, someone had to do something about it. And so an invisible economy developed. One not tracked by merchants, ledgers, or king's edicts, but by quiet arrangements and early morning tasks. Let's break it down. Human waste had to be moved from chamber pots to somewhere beyond. The walls. Animal waste, mostly from horses, pigs, and poultry, piled up in courtyards and alleys. Tannery byproducts, like hair and offal, needed to be dumped before they fermented. Market refused cabbage leaves, fish bones, blood accumulated daily in huge volumes, soot and ash from thousands of fireplaces built, up steadily inside and out. Each of these had its own handler, its own rhythm, its own tools, and its own quiet risks. The gong farmers. Let's begin with the most unfortunate of all. The gong farmers. Gong was an old term for dung. These men were specialists in cleaning privies, primitive latrines attached to homes, inns, and sometimes even monasteries. Privies usually emptied into cesspits, which had to be emptied by hand once they filled. Gong farmers came after midnight not because they were ashamed, but because no one wanted to smell the work while eating dinner, clad in rough wool, face. Sometimes wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloth, gong farmer would climb down into the pit with a long-handled scoop and a rope bucket. Shovelful by shovelful, the pit was cleared and the contents dumped into a waiting cart. The job paid reasonably, well, because no one else wanted to do it, but it came with risks. Poisonous fumes could accumulate in poorly ventilated pits. Occasionally, privies collapsed, trapping workers in waste. And more often than you'd expect, the pit would contain sharp objects, broken pots, needles, bones that caused dangerous infections. Still, the gong farmer worked, quietly, night after night. He might be ignored during the day, but without him, Paris would have sunk literally. The gutter wives where the gong farmers handled what happened in the backyard. Gutter wives tended to what flowed through the streets before modern sewage. Waste often followed gravity down sloped alleys into open trenches or shallow gutters that lined the roads. These were cleaned by women with strong backs and stronger stomachs. Wearing coarse aprons and wooden-soled clogs, gutter wives worked at dawn with brooms, rakes, and buckets. They scraped waste into carts, cleared blockages, and redirected runoff. When rains flooded the streets, their job was dangerous not for the physical strain, but for the diseases they encountered: dysentery, typhoid, and skin ulcers. They were blamed during outbreaks and forgotten during recovery. Still, they kept working. They were often widows, too old for laundress work, too poor for market stalls. But they knew the alleys better than the priests didn't. They had informal power. A gutter wife could ruin your morning with one bucket tossed wrong. Also protect your doorway during floods by diverting muck elsewhere. So neighbors gave them scraps, gossip, and protection, out of charity, but out of respect. The collectors of useful filth, not all waste was discarded. Some of it, especially urine, was valuable. Urine, when aged into ammonia liquid, was a key ingredient in tanning, textile bleaching, and even gunpowder production. So certain collectors, known colloquially as piss gatherers, went door to door with wooden barrels. Households were encouraged to save their urine in chamber pots or designated jars, which the gatherer would collect weekly. In exchange, some homes received a coin, others got nothing. Some simply agreed in order to not be bothered. The gatherer sold the urine to tanners, dyers, and soap makers. The fresher, the better, though most preferred it after a week or two of fermentation. These men and women became part of the city's alchemy of refuse, where the disgusting became economically essential. The smell as a schedule filth determined more than just work at structured time. Markets were swept at dawn before the first. Fish was laid on ice. Streets were sluiced before the heat of midday to reduce stench before lunch. Privies were emptied after midnight, when most doors were closed. Tanneries operated their most pungent work on specific days, known locally as Stinking Thursdays. The rhythm of the city didn't follow bells alone, it followed smells. Watchmen timed their patrols to avoid muck carts. Priests delayed funerals until the market gutters had been rinsed. Bakers, ever conscious of odors, burned herbs in their ovens on Friday mornings, not for taste, but to fight the stench. Drifting from the butcher's quarter, the people everyone looked through, these cleaners, haulers, and gatherers, were both everywhere and invisible. They passed you in the street, their clothes stained and boots heavy with muck. You didn't look at them. Not because you were cruel, but because to look too closely was to remember the truth, that civilization order. Cleanliness structure depended on those willing to carry what others would not. They had no guild, no feast day, no patron saint. They had only the shared understanding that their work mattered, even if no one ever said so out loud. The Paris that never fully smelled clean, despite all this effort, Paris never smelled fresh. Not truly, not fully. The work of the filth handlers was not to eliminate waste only, to delay its consequences, to keep the piles low enough. The gutters are flowing. The privies from tipping over. It was a balance. Too little work and disease spread. Too much enforcement and riots followed. So the city muddled on, alternating between tolerance and complaints, neglect and necessity. And in between it all, the waste workers walked quietly, before sunrise, after sunset, into the mouths of privies and the alleys of blood and the chambers of smell and steam and rot. The city gave them no statues, but it gave them room to work, to vanish and to return again the next morning, you might assume, walking through the muck-slick streets of 14th century Paris. That the waste handlers simply dumped their loads wherever they pleased. After all, it was a messy time, and rules were often flexible. But Paris, even in its most malodorous centuries, did not run entirely on chaos. There was a system, crude, inconsistent, and deeply unpleasant, but a system nonetheless. Because, as long as Paris has existed, it has wrestled with the question no city ever truly answers. Where does it all go? The designated dump sites the medieval city of Paris had official waste zones, called voiries. Designated areas where refuse of all kinds, animal entrails, broken pottery, wastewater, and human muck was supposed to be deposited. These were typically located outside the city walls, or at least near them, near unused marshy land, where decomposition could happen away from homes, or in low-lying fields that could absorb liquid runoff. One of the most infamous was the Voirie de Montfaucon. Located on a ridge northeast of the city, Montfaucon was a multi-purpose horror, not just a dumping ground. It also hosted the city's largest gibbeton, enormous stone scaffold, where executed criminals were displayed, sometimes for months, to rot in the sun as a warning. The stench from Montfaucon wasn't just Badet, was legendary. Writers of the time compared it to open graves, burning leather, and a mouth of pestilence. And yet waste haulers preferred it to alternatives, because it was legal, distant, and no one lived nearby. In theory, the Seine, the city's back door, for all its beauty. The Seine River was a constant temptation for those who wished to dispose of something quickly and quietly. Waste haulers, especially those working late, would sometimes tip their loads over a bridge or carry them to the riverbank and dump them directly into the current. This was officially forbidden. The city depended on the Seine for water, trade, and travel. Polluting it openly was punishable by a fine or worse, confiscation of your cart, a financial ruin for many haulers. But enforcement was lax. At night, with fog on the water and few witnesses about, the temptation was strong, and the result? Chunks of blood-stained straw drifting near the Isle de la Cite. Urines lick foam building near the banks by the tanneries. Sudden discoloration in the water downstream from the slaughterhouses. By the 1350s, complaints from riverside residents, especially the wealthier homes near the left bank, became common. Their solution? Hire private haulers. Waste privilege. The rich dump elsewhere, not all waste was equal. Near Rue Saint-Honore and the expanding moraine, nobles and successful merchants developed their own waste systems, distinct from the city's overburdened routes. They employed private night soil men, often paid double the standard rate, to haul refuse beyond Montfaucon, sometimes as far as St. Denis or into the woods near Vincennes. In winter, sleds were used to carry frozen waste more easily. In summer, waste was sometimes buried in dry fields used later for pasture. Some nobles even had their own hidden cesspits, disguised beneath garden walls or kitchen outbuildings. Of course, these methods weren't purely about sanitation. They were also about status. To remove your waste from the common routes was a kind of social declaration. We are not like them. Ironically, it often meant the waste lingered longer before being moved. But it lingered out of sight. And in medieval cities, visibility mattered more than smell. The problem of overflow: no system is perfect. When it rained in Paris's, it often did everything change. Gutters overflowed. Prives backed up. The official dumping roads became rivers of rot, and carts could not pass through the mire. During these times, waste haulers did what they had to, dumped closer to the walls than permitted, abandoned partial loads in unlit alleys, paid bribes to ditch their barrels in forbidden lots. The city tried to combat this. Inspectors were appointed, patrols were sent, fines were levied. But enforcing waste law during bad weather was like sweeping with a hole in the broom. You could scold a dung hauler, but you couldn't scold a flood? The role of the walls: medieval Paris had walls within walls, a series of fortifications built and rebuilt as the city expanded. And with every new wall came a new border between inside and outside. Waste was always supposed to go outside, but where that outside was depended on which wall was current. In practice, this meant as the walls expanded, old waste sites became new neighborhood. Fields once considered remote became valuable land, which meant dumping had to move further out. And families who once lived near the edge of town suddenly found themselves living in the middle of it with the smell to prove it. One such example was the area around the old Porte Saint-Lazare. Once a marginal field near a small church, it was slowly overtaken by stone houses, and the residents soon discovered that waste buried decades earlier had never fully decomposed. The smell came not from the carts, but from the ground itself. The quiet resistance of the cleaners by the Seine. At the late 14th century, the waste workers began to show signs of organized frustration. They didn't strike, not exactly, but they ignored dumping rules in protest, refused certain neighborhoods unless paid extra, formed informal alliances with butchers' assistants, tanners, and chimney sweeps to bargain collectively. These actions weren't formalized. No records exist of official meetings. But the results were visible. Fewer haulers are showing up in wealthy districts. Delays in privy clearance during feast days. Sudden price hikes for piss collection in parts of the Latin Quarter. The message was clear. If silent, you may not see us, but you will smell us if we go. And so, Quietly, new privileges were granted. Certain families were granted access to unused carts. Some gutter wives received wool from surplus stores as compensation. And rumors swirled of a waste boss, an older hauler who could settle disputes with a glance. No name was ever recorded, but the carts began arriving on time again. What couldn't be moved, not all waste left Paris. Some simply soaked into the ground. The city's foundation layers of broken pottery, crushed bone, old ash, and soft soil became a sponge of centuries. And over time, the smell became part of the city's identity. Travelers complained, clerics condemned, but the Parisians, they endured. Because to them, the smell was not filth, it was proof of life. Of work done in the night by hands no one thanked, and of a system that, while far from perfect, kept the streets passable and the prives from boiling over. Just barely theirs. A rhythm to filth. In a city like medieval Paris, where every barrel of offal, every gutter smear, every chamber pot was just one mist collection away from disaster. Cleanliness wasn't measured by perfume, but by function, whether or not the waste moved. When it did, life limped on. But when it didn't, the entire city began to rot. Not all at once, not with screaming or fire. Just slowly. One blocked ditch at a time, one absent hauler, one overloaded cart, till without anyone meaning to. The streets stopped breathing. Paris remembered what it meant to fear its own body. The waste collapse of 1349, it began with absence. In the spring of 1349, a wave of sudden death swept through the tanneries near the Seine. At first, people thought it was a bad batch of hides or spoiled dye. But then the haulers stopped coming. First 2, then 4. By the end of the month, half of the city's night soil workers had vanished. No one knew yet, but the Black Death had arrived in Paris. Waste still accumulated. People still ate. Animals still walked the streets. But there was no one to carry away what they left behind. So the city began to bury it. Fields just outside the walls became emergency dumping pits. Barrels of urine and dung were tipped into abandoned wells. Stray dogs once tolerated were slaughtered in mass in fear that they spread the disease. The smell was indescribable. Chroniclers wrote that the air tasted like hot meat boiled in vinegar and old iron. Monks passed out during the procession. In the slums near Montmartre, some families burned their furniture just to mask the stench. It did not work. Gutter riots by midsummer. The poorest neighborhoods had had enough. The gutters overflowed daily. Dead animals lay uncollected. Children got sick from playing too close to ditches. And still, no carts came. So they acted. In July, residents of the Rue de la Tixeranderie blocked access to the market square with barrels of filth. They wrote in charcoal on wall plastera, "Demand, we carry our muck ourselves, and let the city smell it." Similar blockades appeared throughout the right bank. Laundry women dumped wash water onto the porches of merchant homes. Masons piled dung at the steps of the chatelet. Bakers' apprentices pelted passing clergy with spoiled rags soaked in privy runoff. No one was killed. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a message. Paris had reached its olfactory limit. Quiet. Hero, the waste widow of Saint Marcel, amid the collapse, one woman emerged from the muck. Her name was likely Agathe, a widow who had once worked as a gutter wife along the Rue Mouffetard. When her husband died from plague, she inherited his cart, his clients, and his debt. She kept working. With no backup and no help, Agathe hauled waste by herself from 6 homes, then 12, then 20. Word spread. She didn't charge coin. She asked for bread, soap, and sometimes just boiled water. When people tried to pay her, she said only, "I'd rather the child didn't step in it tomorrow." By the autumn of 1349, she was clearing more waste alone than most full teams had the year before. Her story faded, of course. It was never recorded formally, but oral accounts persisted. And in one parish ledger from 1351, there is a brief, almost accidental note. To Widow Agathe, for the saving of 25 households from stink. And sorrow, 2 loaves and a shawl. She never asked for thanks. She just kept pushing the cart. how the smell reshaped the city after the plague receded, and half the population with it Paris didn't just mourn, it adjusted. The lessons were hard but enduring. Waste zones were moved further out, with stricter patrols and harsher penalties for illegal dumping inside city walls. Certain haulers were granted protected status, giving them limited immunity from taxation or conscription. For the first time, the city invested in permanent drainage ditches, lined with stone instead of mud, to resist collapse in storms. Guilds, representing tanners, butchers, and dyers, were forced to create shared dumping protocols rather than act independently. The city even commissioned new maps not of streets or churches, but of waste flow, where it pooled, where it clogged, and where it ran freely. This wasn't sanitation as we understand it today, but it was the beginning of a concept that Paris had never truly embraced before: public cleanliness as public order. The legacy of the unnamed by the early 15th century, the waste system had. Partially rebounded, new workers were trained. Some came from rural areas, others from among the plague orphans. Most were young, desperate, and nameless, but they kept the city breathing. Slowly the smell improved, not disappeared. Would never be scentless but muted. A city that once reeked from 5 blocks away now only offended at 2. Gutters ran less red. Slaughterhouse smoke drifted only on windless days. The night soil men still worked at night. The gutter wives still swept in the gray dawn. But now, more people nodded to them in passing. A few even gave them names. Da! City had learned something profound, though few said it aloud. The people who handle filth are the ones who keep death waiting. And still it stank even after reforms, even after plague and riot. Paris still stank. There was no miracle pipe, no clean water system, no sparkling marble latrines. The gutters still ran brown, the pigs still roamed, and every alley had a secret, puddle that no one claimed. But now, people understood why it mattered. And as the centuries passed, the memory of the old waste workers faded not with celebration, but with a kind of quiet respect. They were not saints. They were not heroes. They were just people who showed up to the worst job imaginable because someone had to. And in the end, the survival of the city rested not on knights, kings, or scholars, but on a woman with a cart, a boy with a shovel, and a man who knew exactly how deep to dig before the stink got too strong. In a city lit mostly by shadows, a few things stood out more than a steady candle flame. You saw it glimmering in the narrow windows of churches, flickering through shutters above butcher shops, or dancing uncertainly atop a scholar's desk in the Latin Quarter. At dusk, it marked where supper was being served. At midnight, it was the only thing left between you and the dark. Candles were not just a luxury, they were the quiet infrastructure of night. But very few in medieval Paris stopped to think about where those candles came from, or who made them. Because the truth is, to make light in the 14th century, you first had to handle death. The people who did that, the candle makers of medieval Paris, knew more about mortality, its bodies, and decay than anyone outside a church crypt. The importance of a candle in medieval Christian Europe, light had meaning. A candle lit in church was not simply illumination. It was a symbol of the divine. At a funeral, a candle was a prayer in wax. At a wedding, it was hope. At a bedside, it was comfort. And during Lent, when the world turned inward, a candle was the only. The soundless voice allowed to speak, but candles were expensive. You could buy rushlight's flimsy reeds dipped in tallow for a handful of deniers, but they guttered quickly, and the smell was appalling. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were slightly better, though still smoky and unpleasant. The best, the only acceptable kind for religious and noble use, were beeswax candles, and beeswax was hard to come by. It burned clean, dripped less, and lasted longer, but it could not be faked. You needed real wax, and a lot of it. Which meant the candlemaker's job was not simply artisanate, was a web of quiet deals, grim supplies and unspoken arrangements. The tallow trade, when light smelled like death for most ordinary Parisians. The candle they used at home was made of tallow-rendered fat from cattle or sheep. Tallow was cheap, abundant, and disgusting to work with, Candle makers who specialized in tallow lived and worked in the smelliest corners of the city, often near butcher shops or on the fringes of the riverbank. Where offal could be easily dumped to make tallow, fat had to be slowly boiled down in open vats. The smell was something between burnt hair and wet leather, and it clung to everything: hair, skin, and soul. Apprentices in the tallow trade were usually boys with no family, no trade options, and no allergies to grease. The older candle makers, known locally as graziers, often slept in their workshops to keep the mixture from spoiling overnight. But the worst part wasn't the smell, it was the supply chain. Because in lean years are after battles, famines, or executions, human fat sometimes entered the tallow stream. Not openly, never proudly, but quietly, secretly, sometimes unknowingly. And the old candle makers knew it. The whispered rules of the tallow pots Paris had unofficial rules. No rendering during religious processions, no boiling of fat near markets, on feast days, and above all, don't ask too many questions about where the fat came from. In 1322, a candle maker named Jehanut was fined for foul matter rendered at the wrong time, which was a polite way of saying he boiled human fat during a funeral procession. No one explained how he got the fat. No one needed to. It wasn't common, but it happened often enough that Parisians stopped eating anything that smelled like tallow during plague seasons, because tallow was fuel for lamps, for soaps, and for carts. Above all, for light. People needed light more than they needed truth. The beeswax keepers, separate from the tallow men, were the candle chandlers of beeswax, a more respected, more secretive class of workers who provided light for nobles, clergy, and scholars. They didn't smell like death. They smelled like honey, smoke, and secrets. Beeswax came from a variety of sources: hives tended by monks in monastery gardens, wild nests carefully harvested from forest groves, ported bricks of wax from Provence or Burgundy. But it wasn't just a matter of melting and pouring. Beeswax had to be filtered to remove dead bees, twigs, and pollen. Bleached, usually by laying sheets of wax out in the sun for days or weeks. Mixed, sometimes with minute amounts of tallow to stretch the supply, a dangerous act of fraud if discovered. Rolled and shaped or dipped repeatedly by hand. It was laborious. It was slow. And it was expensive. Full pound of beeswax could cost as much as a peasant's weekly wage. A single altar candle burned through half of that in one long vigil. So beeswax chandlers were careful. They kept ledger books in code, guarded recipes like relics, often hired former monks who knew how to handle wax with reverence. But they had one dirty secret of their own: they knew how much wax came from funerals. Funerals as supply chains. When a wealthy Parisian died, their home might burn dozens of beeswax candles over the course of mourning. Churches would provide tall columnar, candles for processions, and smaller votives for graveside prayers. All told, one noble funeral could use up to 50 pounds of wax. But when the candles burned out or were extinguished, they were not always discarded. Instead, many were collected, melted down, and repurposed. Some were donated to churches. Others were returned to chandlers, who would scrape, remelt, pour against, sometimes reshaping a funeral candle into a wedding taper. No one minded. Wax was sacred, yes. But it was also practical. And the chandlers, standing in the back of each funeral, often watched with keen eyes, not for grief, but for drips, extinguished flames, and leftovers. They didn't speak of it, but they took note. What the candlemakers heard, both tallow and beeswax workers heard things. They were present at moments of birth and death. They provided light to late-night scholars, wet nurses, confessors, and guards. They delivered 2 doorsteps at odd hours. They were ignored, which meant they were present. And so they heard priests murmur last rites while glancing over their shoulder. Widows discuss debts by candlelight. Monks whisper about heresy under flickering wax. Nobles argue about succession after the feast is cleared. The chandlers didn't write any of this down, not openly. But their candles sometimes bore strange mark symbols etched near the base of the wick, invisible once burned. Codes, perhaps, personal notes, quiet memorials? We can't know. But in the ruins of one candle shop near Saint-Germain, archaeologists found a beeswax candle mold with the faint word mort carved into its side. No date, no explanation, just that. The flicker that endured in the end, candles burned away their truth. Whether made of tallow or wax, they vanished slowly, leaving only a curl of smoke, a soot-marked holder, and a puddle of cooled fat. Their makers rarely signed their work. No labels, no seals, just fire. But in every church vigil, every monk's chamber, every hovel where a child sat squinting at a scrap of parchmenta candlemaker had been there first. They made the night survivable, even if they never got credit. Even if they knew too much about what happened after the light went out. Every flame is a risk. In modern cities, we take this for granted. But in 14th century Paris, a city built of timber, cloth, and dried thatch fire was an enemy that arrived in silence. And yet, fire was needed, daily, nightly, unavoidably. The candle was the most practical source of controlled fire in a medieval home. Safer than an open hearth, longer lasting than a torch, and more reliable than a lamp of oil. Let a scribe continue copying a manuscript into the evening. It let a mother check a feverish child. It let a monk read Compline before sleep. But each flame came with a cost. It's cute. And no one understood this better than the candle makers because they didn't just sell light. They sold permission to risk burning the city down. Flammable city Paris in the 1300s was a closely packed city. The streets were narrow, winding, and often damp, but the buildings were not. Most homes were built with timber frames filled with wattle and daub. Roofs were thatched or shingled, both highly flammable. Windows, when present, were often covered with oiled parchment or fabric instead of glass. Curtains, linens, dried herbs, and straw for bedding all made the average room a tinderbox. Add to this the use of open flame from candles, hearths, oil lamps, and cook fires, and the danger became obvious. But candles in particular held a strange duality. They were safer than most fire sources. And yet most house fires started with a candle. When wax turns deadly, a candle seems harmless. But consider the process. A beeswax candle burns clean, but at a high temperature. Tallow candles drip, forming long ribbons of molten fat, which could ignite nearby cloth. Wicks had to be trimmed regularly. If left too long, they formed large, sputtering flames that threw sparks. Some candles were mounted on wooden holders, unstable and prone to tipping. In wealthy homes, where servants might light dozens of candles for an evening's dinner, accidents were common. In poorer homes, candles were used sparingly. Improvised holders led to danger. A mug, a nail on a wall, a lump of clay. The candle fell. The fire spread quickly. Records from city courts and charters show how often the danger was real. In 1331, Gadia de la Draperie was accused of negligence after one of his customers' homes burned down. His candle had been too rich in tallow, making it smoke heavily and drip. In 1346, a fire on the Rue Saint-Denis was blamed on a merchant's apprentice, who fell asleep next to a beeswax taper. Sometimes, these cases led to fines. Occasionally, imprisonment. But more often, the blame was simply absorbed by the phrase, "Everyone used when fire visited, it was the candle's will." The candle policed after too many fires. The city of Paris took action not against candles themselves, but against those who misused them. By the mid-1300s, certain neighborhoods employed wardens, loosely affiliated with parish churches, whose duties included ensuring candles were not left burning unattended during nighttime hours, checking that chandlers used approved molds and wicks, investigating fires to see whether the cause was reckless candle use. These wardens would sometimes inspect homes, particularly those of merchants or scholars, who burned candles into the night. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't shout. They simply snuffed candles, issued soft warnings, and made quiet marks in their notebooks. It was a strange form of governance, not forbidding candles, but regulating how long the city could remain awake. A secret guild? Beeswax chandlers, unlike tallow workers, were part of an informal but tight-knit group not an official guild, but a collection of families and shops who controlled most of the wax supply in Paris. They were deeply aware of their product's power and risk, so they developed their own rules, whispered from master to apprentice. Never sell to a tavern after sundown. Refuse candles to anyone who seems drunk. Mark every large taper with a notch to count hours burned and spot tampering. Never sell a labeled candle near Montfaucon. This rule, oddly, is never explained. Some say these channelers had a hidden code etched into the metal rims of their molds, a symbol to identify the maker in case of disaster. Others believe they carried bits of holy wax remnants from altar candles to blend into their batches as protection. Whether superstition or practice, one thing is clear. The chandlers feared the flame, even as they sold it. When light became a crime, sometimes light was not just dangerous, it was illegal. Certain hours, particularly around Lent or after curfew, were considered times of enforced darkness. During these periods, candles were to be extinguished before Compline, the final prayer of the monastic day. Shielded during processions, too, prevent distraction, and entirely from certain streets known for gambling, brothels, or heretical gatherings. In 1352, the Bishop of Paris issued a temporary edict forbidding any private candle burning after midnight unless for religious devotion or childbirth. This was not about safety, it was about control. Light meant awareness. It meant reading, talking, and conspiring. To burn a candle when others slept was to claim a piece of the night hand. Not everyone appreciated that. Some chandlers found themselves caught in the middle. They were asked to identify customers, explain bulk purchases, or account for sales made too late in the evening. A few resisted, a few cooperated, most simply watched and remembered. Because while the candle's flame lasted only hours, its presence was often enough to change lives. Candle as clock in the absence of reliable clocks, candles became a way of measuring time. Some were marked in hourly notches, burned in studies or courtrooms. Others were known to burn a set length in one Ave Maria, useful for timing prayers or brief meetings. Monasteries used candles mounted on rotating wheels, where the dripping wax filled tiny dishes that rang bells when full. These time candles had to be consistent, which meant the same recipe, poured by hand, watched carefully, and cured evenly. Chandlers who made them were known by name, not fame, but familiarity. A priest might request Margot's mark or the thin roll from Rue des Écrivains, and sometimes they were blamed when time ran short, but mostly they were trusted. Because in a world where day and night were vast and slow, a candle gave you a small, measurable piece of certainty. A wick, a flicker, a breath of time. Candle as witness candles saw everything. They watched births and deaths. They watched trysts and betrayals. They stood by while plague patients coughed and confessors whispered. They burned silently while scribes copied illicit texts. They flickered beside dying children and over bloodied tables where surgeons worked. They were present, and they were the only ones not lying. The chandlers, though no one asked, knew what the candles had seen, not in detail, but in hints. A blackened wick, a wax stain in the shape of a cross, a shortened taper returned half-used, smelling of sweat and lavender. And sometimes the chandlers refused to reuse such wax. They melted it in a separate pot or buried it, or simply lit it in their own shop, letting it burn down in silence. Because some light, they believed, was meant only to vanish,